Relations and International Laboratory on World Order Studies and the New Regionalism of the National Research University High School of Economics, is holding the 33rd session of Eurasian online seminar today. Our guest is a leading US expert in contemporary warfare, Dr. Thomas Xavier Hammers. The topic of his talk will be deglobalization and international security. Dr. Hammers is Distinguished Research Fellow at the Institute for National Strategic Studies of National Defense University. He joined INSS in June 2009. His areas of expertise include future conflict, the changing character of war, military strategy, operational concepts, and insurgency. Dr. Hammers earned a Bachelor of Science from the Naval Academy in 1975 and holds a Master's of Historical Research and a Doctorate in Modern History from Oxford University. He's a distinguished graduate from the Canadian National Defense College. He has published 3 books: Deglobalization and International Security, The Sling and the Stone on War in the 21st Century, and the first Provisional Marine Brigade, the Corps Ethos and the Korean War. He has also published over 160 articles. His publications have been used widely in staff and defense college curricula in the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and Singapore. Dr. Hammers has lectured extensively at leading academic and military institutions in the United States and abroad. Prior to his retirement from active duty, Dr. Hammers served 30 years in the Marine Corps, to include command of an intelligence battalion, an infantry battalion, and the Chemical Biological Response Force. He participated in military operations in Somalia and Iraq and trained insurgents in various locations. Now I have to add here that deglobalization is a theme that has been studied at our faculty for quite some time. There's a lot of interest to it in the world as well. Some people who presented at our seminar, for example, Professor Barry Buzan, also is concerned in his research with the connection between the development of the armed forces and deglobalization. So he deals with that a lot, as well as our faculty, some of our faculty professors, such as Professor Karaganov, who is here today, is also particularly concerned with this topic. Both of these scholars have presented at our seminar, and we're very happy today to have Dr. Thomas Hammers with us. Thank you so much. So the usual format for everybody is to use your real names and wait for the Q&A session at the end. The talks usually last for 45 minutes or so, then we have Q&A at the end. If you'd like to ask something, please write down your name and the question in the chat, and I'm going to call your name at the end, so you'll have the opportunity to ask it. Right, thank you very much, Dr. Hammers. We're very excited to hear what you have to say. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the kind introduction and the opportunity to speak with you. It particularly interests me that there's a good deal of interest on deglobalization. I think it's one of the aspects that is being missed of the 4th Industrial Revolution. I'll go ahead and start share screen now to bring up my slides. Pause just a moment. And okay, you should have my first slide there. I'm going to talk about the 4th Industrial Revolution and how it's impacting international trade. And as I said, I think it's causing deglobalization. And then some of the aspects that apply to security, plus the fact that deglobalization changes the requirements for security. Here's an outline of what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to go a great deal into what the 4th Industrial Revolution is. I'm assuming most of you understand that the 4 revolutions are steam, electricity, then information starting in the 1950s. And then starting at about 2000 to 2010 era, we have this convergence of new technologies, not just information, but biology, material science. It's a convergence of technologies. And what we do know is that all 4 revolutions caused massive changes in the structure and organization, internal of states and societies, and also the international community. So as we said, we're today concerned about deglobalization. I'm going to take a brief look at what I think are the indicators of deglobalization, why we're deglobalizing, and then why it's significant from an economic point of view. Then I'll take a little bit of a look at some of the technologies that are coming out of the 4th Industrial Revolution and how they are changing the character war from, we have gotten ever more exquisite weapons, and more expensive, more exquisite jets, ships, etc. And now we're seeing a change to smaller, smarter, and much cheaper weapon systems, and in what that impact will be on the character of war. So what are the indicators of not just deglobalization, but also regionalization? People tend to think of deglobalization as drawing back within your national boundaries, but really what we're seeing is kind of a regionalization of trade. There's a European bloc, there's a US North American bloc, and there's an Asian bloc built around China. And then there's a Southwest Asia bloc, which really hasn't developed because of the issues between Pakistan and India. So I use the total trade as a percent of GDP of an indication of whether you're globalizing or deglobalizing. If more and more of your GDP is being created by trade, then that's an indication of globalization. You're sending more of your stuff outside your border. If less and less of it is, then that's an indication of deglobalization. You can see China did a conscious drop from back here about 2006. China wanted to shift over to a consumer society because they were concerned of the tremendous dependence on international trade. So you see China drop rapidly. The US recovers from 2008 and then slowly declines. And then the world has been declining really since about 2011. A little bit of a surge there between 16 and 19, but then dropped sharply, obviously in 20. So that's total trade. How does that break out? Well, merchandise trade is also down. And often people will say, well, it's all because services and information is changing things. But in fact, services and trade as a percent of GDP are down. Now, people will note, and the economist notes, that the flow of information is an indicator of internationalization. And that's somewhat true. And there's been a huge growth in the digital trade among countries. But at peak periods, 70% of that is movies and short videos and music. So I'm not sure how globalizing that is from an economic point of view. FDI inflows is interesting. This is foreign direct investment, long-term investment in facilities. This is where you buy something with the intention of running it and making a profit on it. And you can see there was a very quick recovery and surprising recovery after the 2008 crash, then down and was declining sharply. For some reason, that large up spike and then down ever since. And this is pretty much across all the different economies. But what's also interesting is that foreign portfolio investment, i.e. I buy a stock based on a group of foreign investments, which means I'm not investing for the future in that country. I'm trying to create a short-term profit and then I can dump it anytime because I don't actually have an investment in hardware in that country. And all of those tend to indicate to me we're seeing a nervousness about investing heavily in foreign countries as a permanent thing, as opposed to just a temporary investment. So what's causing deglobalization? Well, first off, this is not new. It's a repeated cycle. The difference, though, is historically it has been driven by political problems or security problems. The security problems, World War I is a classic example. The world reached peak globalization in June of 1914. The war starts, breaks up the international global trade, and in fact will not recover to that level of trade until the 1980s. So a 70-year drop in trade because of security issues. Also political issues like the Smoot-Hawley tariffs, things like that, where you have mercantilism, all of those things generally drive it. What has been true in the past is technology has generally driven globalization. Cheaper international transportation, cheaper communication meant it made sense to go out for maximum profit to take care of competitive advantage. But today is different. We're seeing these four areas that are causing deglobalization. And I do list the last as political because in fact, there's a factor of that. But some of that political aspect is driven by particularly technological and social shifts. So what are the technological drivers? Advanced manufacturing, which I think is this conglomeration of 3D printing, task-specific artificial intelligence to control the printing process, and then robotics to replace people. That's changing manufacturing and trade in goods. AI-driven services are changing the flow of service trade across countries. And then, of course, energy production is changing what types of energies we use and where it's shipped from. Now, advanced manufacturing is interesting. If you look at the upper left picture, that is a kind of an average advanced manufacturing plant today. You'll notice there are dozens, if not 100 or so printers, but very, very few people because they're wearing blue coats. They're hard to see in that blue field, but there's about 4 or 5 people in there. I've been to a number of these plants. They have about 100 printers and generally 4 to 5 people running them. While the printers work 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, the people work a standard 40-hour US work week, and the computers manage the printers in the off hours. Another version is on the upper right. You see the gentleman there, that's a BMW plant in Germany. One of the problems Germans have is that the BMW average labor force is 48 years old. So they're having trouble holding parts over their head. So you bring in this little collaborative robot, that's this thing on a stand here. You'll notice it doesn't have a cage around it. The big robots all have cages because they squash people. We've now developed robots that can work in close proximity to people, and these are much cheaper. Whereas a industrial robot still costs $9 to $11 an hour to run. Collaborative robots are down to about $1.50 an hour to run if you run 3 shifts a day. And there are actually services where they are providing, they'll bring it in, they'll install it, they'll run it for you, and those charge about $4 an hour for labor. What does this mean? Well, in the lower left corner, you see the Denali. It's a commercial private business aircraft that you see in Europe. 2-man crew, 8 to 10 passengers, turboprop engine. GE 3D manufacturing in GE was told, redo the engine. When they started the engine at 855 parts, it now has 10. So imagine what that does to the parts supply chain. This whole supply chain problem goes away because you print the 10 parts in-house. So a number of things are happening here. The biggest is the cost of labor advantage is disappearing. Whereas we used to go overseas for cost of labor, nobody works for $4 an hour, or very few places in the world will, particularly for high skilled labor, which is what some of these robots are beginning to do, replace skilled labor. So production's returning to home markets. AI-driven services, which are often called social robots, it's just the phone service you call into, but computer programmers. India grew its IT industry by being a place where if you want to change a pricing scheme or you want to change how you record pricing in your business, you have to write a subroutine to your current software. Well, it was expensive to hire Americans or Europeans to do that, so they sent it to India where it was really cheap. But interesting now, computers are doing their own subroutines. So the Indian IT industry lost 50,000 jobs in each of the last 3 years before the COVID crash. So they were having a huge problem in that it's being replaced. Same with call centers. People like to talk to someone in their own language with their own accent and their own local knowledge. So we're seeing more and more places are replacing their call centers with computers to handle the low-level tasks, and then the upper-level tasks are handled by clerks. All the others here are being replaced by computer systems. And what that means is services are also returning to home markets. The great outsourcing of services to India, to the Philippines, to various places is now returning home. Now, what's the overall impact on US jobs? I haven't been able to find a chart like this for other nations, and you'll obviously see this one stops in 2014 for the US. But what's particularly interesting is you go back here to where all the jobs, non-routine cognitive, routine manual, and non-routine manual, were growing at about the same rate as the economy. And then in about 1990, something happens to the routine jobs. And what happens is the surge of desktops and laptop computers begins to come in, and a lot of the routine tasks are shifted over to computers. The retyping of a letter, you don't do that anymore if everybody's typing on a keyboard and typing their own originals. So all of these sorts of things go, and you'll notice this huge drop. Now, non-routine manual and non-routine cognitive continue to expand at the same rate as the economy. But if you look at this huge drop here, this represents 40 million jobs that have been essentially destroyed by IT or replaced by IT. Now, non-routine cognitive is growing a little bit faster. That's the programmers, the people who build these systems, et cetera. So that's an overall impact in the US. I suspect they're very similar results elsewhere in the world, but you'd need a real economist and not a historian to track that down. Global renewable energy production. This is the growth of renewable energy production, not including hydro. And of course, there's a lot of hydro, particularly being put in Asia. But if you look at that, the tremendous growth in percentage of renewable energy. And that has a huge impact because renewable energy generally is not shipped international or intercontinental. There's an attempt right now, they're working on a project to move solar from Northern Australia to Indonesia and then perhaps on to Singapore. But that's a couple of fairly short distances. It's not the same as moving it from the Middle East to the United States. So while bulk fuel, oil and gas, is moved either by pipeline or by ship pretty easily, renewables, not so much. Renewables tend to be regional. So you'll have a regional net they're trying to build in Europe. They're building one for Asia. The United States is more and more building nets to move the renewable energy from where it is, West Texas, North Dakota, et cetera, to where it's being used. But that reduces international trade. So what are the political drivers? Well, the number one, of course, is populism. And this is a global phenomenon. People began to see their jobs being taken away, began to get concerned about it, started to push for controlling immigrants. A lot of it was blaming immigrants on the loss of jobs rather than technology on the loss of jobs. Protectionism, we're seeing a tremendous growth in tariffs. This spiked heavily after the 2008 crash. About 4,500 protective tariffs were brought into place. Very few of those have been released. And then the third big one is internet fragmentation, which is being politically driven. The internet was going to be the thing that would unite the whole world. Everybody would be able to talk. Everybody could talk to everybody. And we're seeing that China has figured out, no, they don't want that. And it pretty effectively isolated China. Russia's pursuing the same program with help from China. Iran and North Korea are also pursuing it. They want internet sovereignty, i.e. control the flow of information within their country and across their borders. Even the European Union, with the right to be forgotten, the idea that if I've done something and it's been recorded and X number of years have passed, I can ask a court to make sure that's blocked. That means that I have to have a separate set of, of databases for Europe as opposed to the rest of the world. So that is also fragmenting the program. So what's the economic impact? Well, we'll see greater global prosperity because 3D manufacturing can produce massive amounts of stuff much cheaper than when you have people. When your cost of labor drops to near zero, your cost for design changes, is all done digitally and in-house, then the costs come down greatly. The problem is it favors capital over labor, just like the previous generations. And what that is capital buys the new technology, not because they want to pay labor more, but because they want to reduce the total cost of labor. And so while they'll pay more to fewer laborers because they need them for the higher technology, the general mass of labor suffers. And this is true, particularly you can watch it in each industrial revolution. We saw it in the first industrial revolution with a tremendous drop in worker health and benefits all the way through from 1820 when it first got started. It doesn't really recover until about 1870. So you expect this long lag. And we saw this also, as I noted, with the US labor effect flattening out in 1991. We're also going to see regional economies. North America is largely independent already. The US economy, 86% of the US economy is with Mexico, Canada, and the US is contained there. And then about 8% is imports and 7% is exports. So it's fairly independent. And we're beginning to see more and more of that move to regional processing. A lot of the manufacturing is moving to Mexico and the services are moving back to the United States. Europe and Asia are already well-established trading regions. And energy remains a big issue for both of those places. Obviously, Europe draws a great deal of its energy from Russia, and Asia draws a great deal of its energy from the Middle East. But all of these places are working hard to create alternatives in terms of renewables and then in terms of efficiency. One of the big worries is we see premature deindustrialization for the Southeast Asia, Africa, Central Asia, and the Middle East, because those are the low-cost labor areas where, hey, the manufacturer is going to shift there to take advantage of low-cost labor. But if it's cheaper to do robots, and there's a lot of good reasons to move your manufacturing back to your home country. For instance, you don't have to pay for inventory. Normally, when you buy something that's made in China, it comes on your books when it leaves China. So you pay for it all the way across the ocean. You do away with shipping. You do away with knowledge theft. One of the big problems when you make something in China is they will take the intellectual knowledge, copy it, and then try to sell a cheaper version of it. So all of those are reasons to bring manufacturing home. So that's the impact on the economy. What's it going to mean to warfare? And I think what we're seeing is this revolution of small, smart, and inventive versus the few and exquisite. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, NATO understood that they could not begin to match the Warsaw Pact for mass. So if there was a war, they decided they would have to count on precision. So they built a whole series of precision weapons. Well, what happened is all the technologies that were developed for that, GPS, cameras, all the sensors, et cetera, have now been miniaturized and cheapened, mostly for commercial purposes. The drive for autonomous vehicles has led to synthetic aperture radars the size of your fist for $50. So that's changing things. And that means that what used to be few and exquisite, you can now have lots of them and they're fairly cheap. So what are the key technologies? We'll only talk about these 5 today. These are the ones that in the next 5 to 10 years can change warfare dramatically and already have to some degree. Others, quantum computing, material science, and particularly biotechnology are going to create even more dramatic changes, but they're a little farther out. They're 10 years, 20 years out. So I'm going to focus on these 5 more immediate ones. Drones plus AI, of course, the Bayraktar TB2 became famous in the Nagorno-Karabakh war, precision guided munitions, 27 hours up. It created enormous problems for the Armenians. Now, what's interesting is the Harap, which was also there, doesn't get as much attention, but the interesting thing is how relatively inexpensive it is. It's hard to get an actual quote, but I've heard numbers as low as $350,000 per drone. And this drone flies out 600 miles and can then attack autonomously using visual, infrared, and electromagnetic signatures, merging them together to create a target. If it doesn't hit a target, it flies back. That obviously is 600 miles round trip. It's operational in 9 nations. That's what makes it very interesting. This is a challenge to manned aircraft, particularly because it doesn't need an airfield. And that may be the biggest thing you've got to look at with drones and AI is vertical takeoff and landing, because everybody knows where the airfields are and rapidly everybody's getting the ability to attack them. This is the high end of drones. This is the XQ-58 Valkyrie, 2 small diameter bombs or 2 drones. It has a range of 3,000 miles. And at $2 million each, it can actually be expendable when you look at the cost of aviation weapons. The big difference is it's vertical takeoff and landing. There's a demonstration of how you can launch drones from the back of a tractor trailer. So these become mobile and they launch from one location, recover in another, so it can't strike their airfield. They're obviously much cheaper, $2 million a piece. The F-35 fully loaded costs $115 million and then costs a tremendous amount over time because of the high operating costs. Pilot training, maintenance training. There's no pilots in these drones, no maintenance or very little maintenance. So what's been the combat use of drones? Well, the first 5 are all combat use of drones that have been done recently, but they were all radio controlled drones. And that creates a vulnerability. With radio control, I can interrupt it with an electromagnetic signature. The bottom 4, we see the introduction of fully autonomous drones. Now they're not completely autonomous because they still tend to use GPS navigation. And that means they have a vulnerability to jamming that way. So that creates a vulnerability. Whether that continues or not is one of the key questions. And one of the ways that will change that is commercial drone delivery. The really big dollars being put into drones are being put in by firms like Amazon, which wants to deliver by drone globally. Now to do that, it's got to be vertical takeoff and landing because it's got to land on your front yard or your front porch and then take off accordingly. It has to be 1 meter or less accurately. Really, it needs to be about a ½ meter accuracy to get it where you want it. It needs to be GPS independent so it can fly in the urban canyons. And there are about a half dozen different technologies working now that function as GPS independence. So that takes away this vulnerability to jamming. They have to be electronically hardened because they have to fly near airports, towers, radio towers, et cetera, that put out a lot of energy and therefore would fry them if their electronics aren't hardened. They have to be cheap because you're going to lose some. People will try to take them. They will crash. increasing range and increasing payload. Now, when you look at that list, if you are a military planner, you go, that is exactly the drone I want. And we've proven we can build them. In 2014, this University of Virginia professor was asked to 3D print a drone, and that's what he printed right there. He and his design students took several months to figure it out, but when they finally printed it using a 2014 printer, it took them 28 hours to print it and assemble it. It has a 50-kilometer range. That was based on the 2 batteries they put in it, and it cost $800. Most of that cost was for the student's cell phone, which provided the navigation legs, but this was hand-launched and autonomous navigation. Since it has a cell phone in it, it's got a camera in it, and therefore has a limited target acquisition capability. What really makes it interesting is this was back in 2014. In the lower right, you see another 3D printing facility. United Parcel Service, the giant shipping company, has decided that 3D printing will destroy long-range shipping. And so they have started building 100 printer plants in various locations in the world, and they're building a 1,000 printer plant in Tennessee near their central hub. So what does that mean? That means a 100 printer plant could produce 10,000 of these drones per day, because their printers now are 100 times faster than they were in 2014. 100 is conservative. They're really about 200 times to 300 times faster. But to keep the math simple, call it 100 times 100 printers, 10,000 drones. You have a 1,000 printer plant, that's 100,000 drones per day out of a single facility. Now you look at that drone and go, well, it's really not big enough to cause significant damage. But the fact is, we know that a warhead the size of your thumb that weighs a matter of grams can punch through a half-inch of steel. So that size drone can be used to disable wheeled vehicles by crashing into the engine compartment. Any kind of a rocket or rocket artillery, if it crashes into the rocket box, it can penetrate and get a secondary explosion. Are they being mass launched? Well, this is a Chinese 901. It has 10-kilometer light anti-armor. They've actually flown coordinating swarms of 200. That's the back of a truck. That's actually a commercial vehicle modification off a US commercial vehicle. The lower one, of course, is the Harpy or Harop. It's fully autonomous, visual IR, and electronic warfare. So yes, you can launch them in masses, even if you print them in tens of thousands. Multiple rocket launchers have proved you can launch thousands and thousands of weapons in volleys. What makes it really more interesting in the missile field is the long-range cruise missiles. Now, the one at the top is the famous Tomahawk. An anti-ship cruise missile now goes over 1,600 kilometers. Land attack, same range, 1,000-pound warhead. That is launched off a container that's about the size of a standard 40-foot shipping container. The Joint Light Tactical Vehicle Blow, married to the Naval Strike Missile, that's a 180-kilometer weapon, but it's obviously very easy to conceal. And then the high mobility rocket system of the US Army, US Marine Corps, they're developing a PRISM, which by this year will go out to 480 kilometers. They've done a couple of successful tests. By 2025, they're going to get out to 800 kilometers. And again, these are precision weapons. So it changes the battlefield a good deal. Containerized weapons aren't new. The Club K program developed by Russia. They've been selling these for about 10 years. The land attack cruise missile, 2,400 kilometer range. The anti-ship cruise missile, about 600. They're improving the capability of both of those. They've been tested. This type of container launch system has been tested by Russia, China, Israel, the US Marine Corps, and soon the US Navy. The one in the lower left is actually a Chinese system, which was displayed at a trade show. Obviously, you wouldn't put those two launchers together. It was simply a demonstration of different types of rockets you could put in the same container. Now, what do you do with them? Well, the beauty of a containerized weapon is you can hide it in plain sight. One of the things we know now is there's persistent surveillance. I'll talk in a minute about why that comes about. So if you're out there looking like a military truck, I will know where you are and I will have enough cheap drones to come after you. But if I look like a Maersk truck or one of these little white Isuzus, you can't kill all the white trucks in the country. You cannot kill all the containers in the country. So the problem is you've only got about 10 minutes from the time the container lid comes up until the missiles are away. The bottom picture is the Israeli long-range artillery system. They just strapped that to the top of this small container ship or small cargo ship, breakboat cargo, and launched it. They got a hit on a moving target at sea at a range of 100 kilometers, and again at a range of 400 kilometers. Different launch, obviously. Now, why am I concerned about constant surveillance? Well, cheap space is the difference. The lower right-hand corner shows the nanosat launches from a couple of years ago. Now, as recently as 4 years ago, when you looked at the numbers, they were projecting that by 2030, we would have 30,000 satellites in orbit. That estimate now is 100,000 satellites in orbit. What that means is constant surveillance of the planet. Capella Space is a firm that does synthetic aperture radar and hourly will provide half-meter resolution imagery on an hourly basis. So they can look through cloud, they can look through weather, they can look through vegetation. Hawkeye is a firm that does electronic warfare location of a target to 3 kilometers every hour as they complete their launch program this year. Imagery, there are 20 companies now that are imaging the entire planet in visual, infrared, and increasing it's going to be in synthetic aperture radar every 24 hours. Now, what's interesting about this is it's commercial demand. It's not military demand driving this. They want it for futures. For instance, if I'm doing futures, I want to know what the wheat crop in Russia looks like. And the more accurate I can get, if I can get multispectral imagery and see that this part, while the wheat looks pretty good, actually we know it's suffering from rust, or it's suffering from water shortage, or hey, this is a great crop. Russia's going to have a bumper crop this year, therefore wheat prices will be down. That's what's driving this. And what's also driving it then is a commercial demand for change tracking, so that they'll take a picture every day and then the computer will analyze it and say, hey, something interesting is happening here, and shift it to the civilian analyst. And of course, the upper picture is simply the size of a CubeSat. It's 10 centimeters on a side. It's all the bigger they are. Now, how good are the pictures? Well, this is a picture from Digital Globe. One of the US think tanks wanted to know what China was doing in the South China Sea. So they got this picture about 24 hours later, and you'll notice it's annotated. Now, so sailors don't feel left out, autonomous UUVs, unmanned underwater vehicles. The upper left are the transoceanic ones that have been being used for oceanic survey. They harvest the thermocline and therefore can stay out there for 5 years. So we're beginning to see transparency beginning to be brought to the ocean, because we're finally beginning to map the ocean. We've only mapped about 5% of the bottom of the ocean. This is expanding very rapidly with these type of systems. And of course, if you put a mine on this type of system, it becomes a self-deploying mine. The lower right is Boeing is building the extra large unmanned underwater vehicle for the US Navy. They're building 3 of these. They'll be 30-day endurance, fully autonomous, and will operate able to deliver mines or torpedoes. Now, one of the things we're counting on to protect us from swarms are lasers. These are 3. The upper left corner is the US Army is actually fielding a platoon of 4 of these laser-equipped light armored vehicles. They're designed for anti-drone defense and anti-artillery defense, artillery and mortar. The one on the ship has actually been tested by the US Navy repeatedly. The one on the F-16 is still an Air Force fantasy, but they're working toward that. The idea is lots of cheap shots fairly quickly, and therefore you can deal with this swarm. Right now, we don't have any air defense that could deal with an inbound swarm of several hundred or even 1,000. Microwave systems have more potential because they can do a blast over an area and engage multiple targets at the same time. These are actual test systems that have been in the field and they've been tested against live targets and succeeded. The problem is with directed energy, both lasers and microwave, the advantage is to land-based defense. So if you think you're on the defense or are on the defense, not invading, then the advantage is the land-based because they require massive amounts of power. A ship or an airplane can only bring so much power, or a vehicle can only bring so much power, whereas land-based fixed, you can tap into power grid, you can line up as many generators as you want. The other thing is concealment. You saw they're fairly small systems. If you take them off those very military-looking trucks, put them on a building or in a commercial vehicle in a container, then they're just going to look like commercial vehicles. So you won't actually see them until they start to engage you and you sense the laser. Obviously, it's not going to be a visual wavelength. The weaknesses, of course, are lasers are still subject to smoke, haze, reflective coating, weather conditions. They all make lasers not a 24-hour, 7-day-a-week. Whereas microwave is always good, but the problem is that we've had Faraday cages to protect electronics for a long, long time. And now we're 3D printing hardened electronics. So this can create a offense-defense problem. How much energy do I have to generate to burn through, and how many generators do I need? So that we'll have to see. Hypervelocity is the other big one everyone's talking about. But in fact, I don't see it as a huge change for nuclear deterrence until we massively improve our missile defense, ballistic missile defense. Currently, a boost glide takes about 30 minutes to get from one side of the globe to the other, which is about the same as a ballistic missile. So there's not a change in time. And since even the very best air defense systems are with multiple shots, maybe have a 90% reliability. Well, if 10% of nuclear weapons get through, your society ceases to exist in any case if it's a significant attack. Even a limited attack of, say, 200 weapons like China could launch, that would mean 20 get through. And if 20 US cities go away, the US ceases to function as a society. Where there is huge impact for hypervelocity is multimodal systems, air, sea, and ground launch cruise missiles, because they threaten all conventional facilities. And right now, most militaries still require very large bases, particularly air forces and navies require large bases to operate. Those fixed facilities or large platforms like large ships are going to be very, very vulnerable to these hypervelocity weapons. So what are the implications? Well, for irregular war, for insurgency, everybody has long-range precision strike. Swarms are being seen. We saw the Yemenis, probably with Iranian help, launching swarms against the UAE and against Saudi Arabia with significant success. If you look at the strike on the Saudi oil facilities, you see tremendous precision in the imagery of the 13 that were at the facility, either 9 or 11, I can't remember which, were hit in almost exactly the same position of the big storage tanks. Convergence will favor non-state actors. They have less target discrimination in that they're more willing to shoot at anything, and little infrastructure to protect. While the state has to protect its own facilities, its buildings, its legislature, its all of its industrial facilities, an insurgent doesn't have anything he really has to protect, or very, very little. States are at a disadvantage because currently all defenses against terror attacks are based on ground or indirect fire attacks. The Israelis are probably the most advanced in this with their Iron Dome concept. But even the Iron Dome can be overwhelmed by swarms. Key infrastructure and gatherings are vulnerable, and then, of course, defensive logistics. One of the huge problems in Iraq and Afghanistan was the use of IEDs. Now the IEDs can fly in from a good distance off the road. There's a new drone called the Drone 40. It launches out of a 40mm grenade launcher. It actually can be thrown in the air. It can fly 15 kilometers and destroy a small armored vehicle. So you would have to clear your lines of communication out to 15 kilometers on both sides to hold an area, and that creates great opportunities for insurgents. There's a powerful role for outside sponsors, as we've seen with the Yemenis firing anti-ship cruise missiles at the US Navy and firing long-range drones and cruise missiles at Yemen and Saudi Arabia. So we're going to see this with insurgents, where it used to be you would pull back into your base, you're pretty much invulnerable. They'd do an occasional mortar attack or rocket attack or something like that. But you're going to see precision attacks from great ranges. It may not even be from in the territory of the country you're fighting. It may come from outside. It may come from a ship, so in international water. So then who do you retaliate against? It's going to get very, very interesting with irregular war. On conventional war, I think the defense becomes dominant. I think the advent of persistent surveillance means you can't hide your forces, and therefore any offensive force must create a signature because it moves, and that creates a signature, you're going to get hit. Whereas a defensive force can remain passive, rely on passive surveillance, and so they know where the offensive force is and don't have to launch until they're ready. The other nice thing about defense is you can set up these containers of weapons. If you go that way, they can be at a distance from you. The lid comes off, the missiles or drones fire, and then there's just an empty container. So the offense can fire back, but all they hit is an empty container. Mass with precision is doable today. 1,000 drone dumb swarms doable. We've already seen 200 drone smart swarms already done. But if you make a signature, you can be hit. And if you're dispersed in these 20-foot containers that operate either independently or as part of a network, you can be a very, very powerful defense. And again, this also applies, all of these things apply to the insurgent fighting an outside power or a domestic power. In the sea domain, defense will become dominant to increasing ranges. You've seen what the Chinese have done with their missile and drone. The Chinese from mainland China can reach out halfway across the Mediterranean Sea. That's how far from Western China they can reach east. They can reach well out to the second island chain. So these are increasing ranges, which make it very, very difficult for large surface combatants to move in close. Small states and insurgents are challenging navies. As I've noted, that we've had multiple launches of cruise missiles at navies by insurgents. At sea, the value will rapidly become the weapon, not the platform. So you want to think in terms of missiles, drones, and mines, but cheaper platforms, because if you've got all your weapons on one platform and that platform gets hit, then the value of those weapons is zero because you can't launch them. So we're going to see smaller platforms that probably are easier to camouflage, and they'll use these types of weapons as opposed to manned aircraft. Conventional air domain, the real problem is that fixed bases become untenable. Everybody knows where your bases are. Everybody will know when your aircraft are on the ground, and they can then attack them. The Harap drone with a 600-mile range is the same as the effective operational range of the F-35. So the F-35, unless it's going to go to tankers, has to take off within range of enemy drones. Cruise missiles, of course, have much greater range, 2 and 3 times the range of a manned aircraft. It's also possible to attack your command and control aircraft and your tankers on the ground. And remember, it doesn't take much explosive to kill an airplane. If I can get, call it 30 grams or 100 grams of high explosive material near an aircraft on the ground and detonate, I'll get a secondary alpha fuel on board and therefore destroy the aircraft. Evolved cruise missiles and drones are already taking over many of the missions of aircraft. So with the right weapons, defense can dominate. If you get off the airfield and base your air power on the back of trucks, in containers, et cetera, then you change the air defense problem immediately. One huge problem is our manned aircraft range obsolete, simply because we haven't been able to figure out how to push them out to the 1,000 miles that cruise missiles are routinely attaining. And even as we begin to push manned aircraft out with the next generation cruise missiles is going farther. In conventional space, it will be heavily congested and contested. Everyone has access to space, as I noted, from commercial space, surveillance, communication, and even attack. Commercial firms are now offering to refuel and repair your satellites on orbit. If they can get close enough to refuel or repair it, they can certainly destroy it. Rapid space replacement is involving both commercial space, drones, balloons, so that we can very rapidly replace it. One of the key issues in space is going to be position, navigation, timing for civilians. That comes off the GPS type or BIDO type satellites. Each major power is developing its own satellites, but there are a limited number of these. If you take those out, then the particular timing, which is what allows your computer systems to talk to each other, to stay in sync. So all of your cache outlets, all of your cashiers that are connected to a computer, all of these things go out of phase and out of sync, and therefore the society begins to have major problems. Conventional cyber domain, keep in mind that cyber will not be fought just in cyberspace. It won't be just people in dark rooms fighting other people in dark rooms. It will also be identifying and taking out critical nodes. We know generally where fiber optic cables come ashore. We know where the downlink stations are. We know where the major network places are. You know pretty well where the big server farms are. Those can all be destroyed by cruise missiles. So the fact of long-range precision is also changing cyber. The conventional wisdom is it's offense dominated because it costs less to attack than defend, but there's getting significant pushback. I'm not enough an expert on cyber to know. I simply know that the cyber experts are arguing about this pretty intensely. The historical precedence is there's never been a better medium for espionage or commercial theft than cyber, but the destructive attacks have been fairly limited. Everything from Stuxnets to NotPetya have had impact that's been limited and not as decisive as people had thought. Electromagnetic domain may, in fact, be the critical domain. It too will be contested by combined arms. If you put on a jammer, somebody will find it and try to get on it with a conventional weapon or a kinetic weapon. Russia has been extremely successful with EW in Ukraine, Syria, and Nagorno-Karabakh. Russian EW tactical and operational in the field is maybe the best in the world. China with its strategic support force hasn't revealed much what it can do yet, but the fact that they consolidated all information, electronic warfare, cyber, and space in a single major command indicates they're really looking at that as a major element in future warfare. So all of this is coming, and as I said, over the next 5 to 10 years. So what is the traditional transition pattern? There is a historical pattern. A new technology is discovered. Somebody says, oh, this could be a helper. Like when pikes were the dominant weapon in infantry battalions in Europe, when a musket first came along, it was too slow, it was compact, it was complex. So they used it as a helper. They put it out on the flanks of the pike formation, and they fired and killed some of the enemy pikemen before they got there, and then the musket guys had to run away. But as the musket got better and better, and finally got the bayonet, which you could attach over the end of the barrel of the musket, it fully replaced the pike. We see the same thing. The battleship first uses airplanes to find the enemy fleet and look over the horizon to spot the follow shot. And then over a period of about 20 years, the carrier comes to dominate it, mostly because of range. Again, in each case, you look historically, it's very often range that makes the dominant weapon system obsolete. Any armored knight could kill any peasant if he could just get close enough, but the peasants got crossbows and therefore could kill you from a distance. We're seeing the same thing with manned aircraft replacing, or cruise missiles replacing manned aircraft. It's a range thing, as well as you don't want to risk the aircrew. So they were helpers in Gulf War I, they're partners in Gulf War II in Afghanistan, and they're becoming a replacement. So this is the historical pattern. The current weapon system will continue to be used, and they'll slowly be replaced by new systems. So what are the operational implications? Well, the big one is that everybody has long-range precision strike, to include insurgents. That means all homelands are vulnerable. Even the United States, which is characteristic, had the two great oceans to protect it. Commercial ships carrying cruise missiles and containers, it will be almost impossible to keep them all away from the coast of the United States unless we just shut down all commercial shipping. Mass with precision will be available at the tactical level, even to insurgents, as we see with the Yemenis, but the Chinese, Americans, and Europeans are all rushing to create this. Power projection will be much more costly. If you try to move into another country, whether they fight you initially with conventional forces or go to insurgency, it's going to be much, much harder to do that. So the defense is becoming dominant. Strategic implications is defense dominant on air, land, and sea. Cyber is escalatory because if it's offense dominated, it's escalatory because you got to go first. Space and electronic warfare will be heavily contested. Mass is going to return and is returning to the battlefield. When an opponent can put a swarm of 200 drones operating intelligently over your head, that's a mass attack. And again, that's just the beginning. We're at the very early phases of drone warfare. National mobilization may well be required. And with that, this is the long version of that talk, is in this brief or in this book, probably at your library. If not, Amazon's the cheapest way. Because I work for the US government, I can get no royalties. So pitching it doesn't do me any good, just to get the ideas out there so you can argue about it. And with that, we'll turn it over for questions.
Thank you so much. This is an amazing amount of information condensed for us in this presentation. Thank you. Could we, would anyone like to start with a question or comment? If not, then yeah, I'm going to give the floor to Professor Lukin, please.
Yes, well, I'm not an expert on all this technical things, but I think the main idea, do I understand you correctly that the main idea is this because everyone is vulnerable and kind of every country, at least every big country, can now have enough military power for its own defense and make others vulnerable. Then the idea of globalization is that they don't need globalization now, and they can kind of survive separately without an alliance with somebody or without protection of other powers. And this kind of ruins the Western domination or anybody else's domination.
It's not so much that the military is causing deglobalization. Deglobalization, and that's what's different, is being driven by economic reality. It is much cheaper for me to produce domestically, and we saw that there's been a great deal of manufacturing returning to the United States. This may surprise you, but President Trump didn't get his facts right with the collapse of manufacturing. Manufacturing has actually been growing in the United States, not as fast as the rest of the economy, but it's been steadily growing. And because you're replacing cheap labor with automation, robotics, and because 3D printing reduces the number of parts, then you reduce the supply chain, and therefore it makes more sense to produce domestically. You're also closer to your market, which is a big deal now. A rapid response to a customer. If I have to make it in China and ship it, it's going to spend 30 to 45 days at sea and in shipping. Whereas if I produce it in Pittsburgh, it takes 1 day to ship it to wherever I want to ship it. So this is making the change. The military aspect reinforces that, because forcing your way into the world doesn't work as well anymore. It'll be much more expensive. So one of the big concerns in the US is there's already a movement in the US toward isolationism, where America doesn't want to continue to be overseas. We spent a lot of money in Afghanistan and Iraq. We didn't get anything for it. We lost a lot of blood over there. Why do we do this? And it's always been the internationalists who said, oh, because globalization makes the economy so much better. We're getting indications that's not true anymore. And the globalization actually very often hurts the lower income people in a country. So they're beginning to get a resistance and maybe a coming isolationism. And that would be interesting if we end up with essentially 3 trade regions, like I said, North America, Asia, and Europe. What does that do to international security arrangements? Are nations willing to go out into the rest of the world if they perceive it not to be economically necessary?
Thank you very much. We have a comment from Professor Sergei Karaganov, please.
Thank you for the most delightful and professional talk I've seen in years. I have 2 questions. The most I agree with your arguments. What about the change of the modern human? We are used to deter a certain type of people who love their family, their motherland. What about the cosmopolitan mass youth? One question. And the second question is even more important. What about the armaments of the god? That is nuclear weapons. What about nuclear deterrence under circumstances? What you have said means that, I mean, the blurring of conventional, non-conventional, local and regional warfare are being blurred. But then what about the ultimate resolution of conflict? The role of nuclear, whatever nuclear weapons. And I've said that nuclear weapons is kind of a weapons of God in our mindset. You know that better or than me.
Professor, thanks. 2 interesting questions and that I needed to address. The cosmopolitan view leads to this whole idea of a citizen of the globe. And there's a class of people who are wealthy and well-educated who have moved around, who maybe were born in Australia, went to school in England for college and in grad school to the United States, and now work in Singapore or China. Where's their loyalty? That's a good question. And that percentage of the population has a different view. But most people are still grounded in geographic reality. The vast majority of people are still in their home country or trying to immigrate to a country, but not as a matter of personal choice, but matters of necessity. I mean, they're just trying to survive. So that's going to be interesting. And we see that in the United States in some of the discussions. Some of the very cosmopolitan people are still big. We have to be out in the world. We have to be a globalist. And there's this whole argument within the United States that that's the key, but a lot of pushback too that are saying, no, we don't. That's not our community. So this will be another one of those fissures that will happen in societies as these people go. The other interesting thing is a lot of these people are fleeing to tax havens. So there's beginning to be increasing resentment to that fact that, hey, you know, a guy like the owner of Amazon paid 0 taxes in the United States last year from his personal tax, despite making billions of dollars in wealth. That's really beginning to irritate people. We'll see if there's a backlash against that. We're kind of toward the end of what in America was called the Gilded Age in the late 1800s, where the very, very wealthy dominated politics and really dominated the economy. And then they got a pushback, which we call the Progressive Era, and that may in fact be starting. Nuclear deterrence remains the ultimate, as you said, is the God weapon. The key thing is going to be America has provided a nuclear guarantee for our allies since the beginning of nuclear power in the interest of reducing the proliferation of nuclear weapons. There is beginning to be concern among allies that maybe the United States won't be there, particularly under the Trump administration, which was hostile to allies and constantly challenged. The Biden administration is much more of a traditional American post-World War administration. You've got to be engaged in the world. But there's concern in Korea, even in Japan. Will this nuclear deterrent hold? And if not, do we require nuclear weapons of our own? And so this may be one of the impacts of deglobalization will be proliferation of nuclear weapons. And I think that's something we've got to keep an eye on and be aware of. And then where it goes from there is going to be very interesting, because while precision, some people say, well, precision gives you the effect of nuclear weapons. It does on specific targets, but it doesn't wipe out a whole city. And that's what a nuclear weapon, particularly as you move in the megaton range, can do. It can destroy entire cities. And if you take out a few key cities in a country, you've essentially totally disrupted their economy and moved them back hundreds of years in economic progress.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have a few more questions in the audience. Professor Richard Sacco, please.
Right, thanks. Thanks very much for an enormously informative overview of these new weapons and so on. What I'd like to ask is about the state of the debate about civil-military relations and, above all, civilian control over this. Given the fact that sometimes these weapons, you know, the response time, as in nuclear, there's a whole set of protocols of how to manage nuclear weapons and launch protocols, etc. I just wonder what the state of the debate is today about civilian control over all of these, including some treaties in terms of proliferation of weapons in space and so on. So I just wondered if you could update us a little bit on that sort of sphere of activity. Thanks.
Well, the conventional weapons, the cruise missiles, the drones, those are all handled in a normal military process. There's no issue there. The key issue really, and space, there is a ban on space to earth weapons, but not on space to space weapons. And we've begun to see various nations test things in space. The Chinese took down a satellite, Russians took down a satellite. We are seeing this capability there. It's obviously present. Even commercial firms can do this now. So that'll be interesting. Space doesn't worry me as much because with 100,000 satellites, you'd have to do an awful lot of work to create the effect you want. Again, with the notable exception of GPS. And if you take out GPS, you really, really crash the global economy. Because I'm assuming that if you take out our GPS, we take out your GPS type approach from any nation that has GPS. So the real one we're talking about is cyber. And what's the cyber decision? And that's why if cyber remains offense dominated as perceived, it is incredibly escalatory. If you're in a planning meeting and you're briefing the boss on options, the boss being in this case, the President of the United States, then he may ask, well, when should I decide on triggering the response? And with cyber, the answer is probably about a second ago. Because otherwise, this can start and cascade before you have a chance to shut it off, before we can even brief you on it. So obviously, the controls on that are classified at very high levels. I'm not a cyber expert, so I'm not involved in that. I know there's a great deal of discussion in the think tank world. How do you do this? How do you set up defenses? The only encouraging thing is that you're dealing with complex adaptive systems. And as we saw in the Russian attacks on Ukraine, and we saw in the US effort Stuxnet, the complex system responds pretty quickly and fairly effectively. While there's a limited, relatively short-term, days, weeks, maybe a month effect, it's not catastrophic as we perceived it's going to be. So we haven't seen a major attack on power systems yet, so we don't know. Could they really do what they say they can do to a dam and cause a dam to malfunction? We don't know that. There's speculation. So the actual discussion of how to use these weapons is active, ongoing. About the infant stage of where the discussion on nuclear weapons was in, say, 47, 48, if you go back and read the transcripts of some of those, it's fairly interesting discussions. Huge problem that needs both academic and government attention and some very serious discussion about the implications.
Thanks a lot. Thank you. We have a question from Mark Pitchgar as well.
Yeah, good evening. Thank you very much for your lecture. It's very interesting. I have two questions. First one's regarding the current state of Russian air defense. Like you said, all those drones and cruise missiles can be produced in huge quantities. And would you say that it is a mistake on the Russian part to invest so heavily into missile-based air defense rather than microwave and laser-based weapons, which can be essentially, well, unlimited ammunition? And my second question is, what do you think is the likelihood of proliferation of cruise missiles, drones, and all those sorts of long-range engagement weapons to privatized military groups and companies? Thank you.
Yeah. The first question is not just a Russian question. I mean, every nation has to decide missiles, guns, electronic warfare. I have not tracked the Russian investment in this. The US is using a portfolio, some money on lasers, some money on microwave, more money on missiles. The problem with missile air defense in the US is that it has big industrial backers. There's big money in air defense. So if you bring along a truly cheap system, it doesn't grab a hold quite as well. But as I said, the key problem is limitations. We still need a lot of testing. For instance, does dazzle paint really reduce it? A laser has to have a certain amount of dwell time to burn through. If the target is simply rotating, so the laser spot is moving around, then it takes longer to burn through. Of course, you respond to that by increasing the power of the laser. That increases the energy required. So now it becomes more and more a defensive weapon because you can't drag that much power around with you. But suppose smoke with certain types of particles dephases your laser. Could you have the first wave of missiles generate smoke? So the next wave comes through the smoke and I reduce the time of response. We've got to experiment with that. We've got to experiment with microwave to see how much shielding does, because we know we can shield. We've shielded certain key electronics from nuclear blast. That was mastered back in the 70s and 80s. Can we use advanced manufacturing to do, when you 3D print the electronics, are they already shielded? Can you, by 3D printing, create multiple sets of electronics in the same piece of equipment so that when one is knocked out, then the next one can be kept offline and protected? All those types of experiments need to go on. And your second question was about?
Hey, there we go. Thank you. The second question was about what is the likelihood of proliferation of long-range engagement weapons to private military corporations, whether that be Russia or US?
Yeah, I'm going to assume that they're going to buy them. They'll start with cheap drones. I mean, already we're seeing the use of drones by contract companies just because it makes sense. It makes no sense to send an expensive mercenary out there to get it. You know, right now we do reconnaissance, stick your face around the corner and see what's there. That's a really bad idea. If I got a cheap drone, I can throw it around the corner. That makes much more sense. So we're already seeing drones. We're seeing, and we'll see very rapidly, these longer range attack systems. Israel has an entire package of autonomous anti-armor weapons, various ranges. So we will see this fairly quickly. How far up the scale they go will depend upon how big the contract is. Because remember, mercenary has to make money, and how much can I get the sponsor to fund up front? How closely is the mercenary actually tied to the government? The closer it's tied to the government, the more access it will have to this type of weapons and more assurance of funding for them. So I think we should expect to see it, not in huge quantities. It'll depend upon what conflict you're in. And again, I don't think mercenaries do that well against conventional military forces, just because, well, we saw what happened to the Russian mercenaries when they came up against the Americans in Syria. They got hit hard by aviation support that they didn't have available. So if you're a mercenary, you're going to go, well, that's probably not a good contract to have. Let me find a contract where I'm in Africa or somewhere where I'm fighting someone more with my level of capabilities. Okay, thanks for good questions.
Thanks. We have a couple more, actually. There's one very interesting question in the chat from Alexandra Butcherova.
Yes, thank you very much for your interesting lecture. My question concerns the current state of Chinese armed forces. So does the ongoing dynamics in Chinese armed forces allow us to place China on the leading positions in terms of world leadership?
China has made massive, massive advances in the military capability in the last 20 years. Of particular importance has been the reorganization recently to go to a joint command and going to regional commands rather than the way they were organized. So they're becoming joint. The interesting thing to keep in mind is the United States did jointness with our law in 1986, but we're still struggling with it. And we've had more experience with joint than anybody in the world, probably. So this is not an easy transition, particularly not in China, which has been dominated by the army for so long. They have that problem. The next problem they have is they're tied to a political commissar system in effect. And so a commander has a partner who's a political officer, and that creates command problems. Then the fact that it is a party army, not a national army. The army or the armed forces, the PLA, exists to make sure the Communist Party stays in power. And so it's part of the constant power struggle within Chinese politics. And so that also complicates the process of transition. Then they're a military that has just begun reaching out, say about a decade and a half ago, they started to do their patrols in the Arabian Gulf. They're beginning to build a seagoing Navy. They're beginning to build an Air Force that can reach out. We haven't seen a lot of tankers yet, and tankers are going to be essential if you want to send air power a great distance. We're beginning to see them build the logistics ships that they need to sustain themselves if they're going to go out to the first island chain and beyond. So they are creating the reality of power, certainly in the first island chain and reaching out to the second island chain. And this is why all of Southeast Asia is hedging. They like China for the economic benefit of being in trade. They like the defense benefits of the United States because while we impose certain things on them, it's less than they've seen China impose. So that's going to be an ongoing thing. Then the question is between those who think China is on an inevitable rise and those who see the enormous problems China has, the debt problems, the stability problems. Xi transition when he finally transitions. He's 68, so another decade or two. So how do you handle that transition? The fact that they've hit the middle income gap and the middle class is not growing and they're getting a little bit angry and frustrated. You see that China is actually spending more money on internal security than on the PLA. That's something, can you sustain that? It's had this tremendous growth for years. Can it sustain it now that the growth numbers have fallen off? And that the growth numbers will probably stay low because of the nature of the middle income gap. China's ecological and water problems are enormous. Can they have the technology to get past that? 20%, they admit that 20% of their land is poisoned by heavy metals. They are still growing crops on that 20% and still feeding it to their people. There's probably no greater damage to a child's brain than heavy metals in food. So all of this is ongoing, and it's a key question. They've done an enormous job of managing 1.2 billion people out of poverty. Can they continue this or not? As they begin to crack down, one of the problems is you go to more and more restricted leadership, where a small group of people make all the decisions tend to get worse and worse. So interesting question, probably the biggest question for international security today is whether China.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Finally, we have something from Olga Krasner, please.
Hello. Thank you very much for your insightful presentation, Dr. Hammes. So, if we're getting back to the beginning of your presentation, when you were talking about deglobalization and all these processes and process of localization, and my question is about maybe different national security issue, which you didn't touch upon because it's a part of other security issues, which is public health, which you just briefly mentioned in your previous answer. So what do you think, what kind of impact of the processes of globalization would have on global health? Because we see during the pandemic, it's not about cooperation mostly, well, it's about addressing all these questions on the national level. So anyways, public health, it's a national security issue. And so I'm interested to know what you think about it. Thank you.
Yeah, as you said, we have to work very hard on public health. That's been a neglected aspect of international. The good news is the bio-revolution, as we saw with this very, very rapid 1 year to go from identifying the disease to having a vaccine, is absolutely incredible in terms of speed. We are now actually working on the possibility of a universal vaccine. Then you get into cost. And this is where we get into a real problem with the US medical system not being government sponsored, but we pay 3 times as much per person for medical health in the United States as the rest of the world, but we don't get particularly better results. So we've got that problem, is a huge overlying problem. We're beginning to get the idea of sensors where you wear a sensor that monitors your health. Telemedicine is growing. We're beginning to see the advent of cheap, we've now got the sonic systems for checking that are actually hand portable. India has a tremendous industry in developing inexpensive technology for essentially village doctors. So if we can do that and spread that globally, we have a chance to really change things. But probably the biggest thing remains basic nutrition and clean water. I mean, clean water is probably the single biggest thing we could do for public health globally. Good news is technology is developing to do that. We're beginning to get desalination plants down to regular commercial water prices. So that would be a huge improvement for large parts of the world. But I would say that if I were investing in it, it would be clean water and identifying the major diseases like they've done with malaria and see what we can do about it. But it remains a major security issue, because if your population is unhealthy, they're going to try to migrate and get away from it. And mass migration is going to be one of the huge disruptors, particularly for Europe.
Interesting, thank you. We have a follow-up from Mark Pitchker, who asked something earlier, and I think we'll finish it there. We'll leave it off there. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I just thought it would be very nice to ask you one more question as somebody who is just very knowledgeable on all of this. This is kind of going away from military hardware and more focusing on geopolitics. So as you know, the United States, I think they have recently ratified the AUKUS, the alliance between the United States, Australia, and the UK. And so, like you said in the beginning of your presentation, there is a prospect of the United States rolling back towards isolationism in the coming years. Meanwhile, it is trying to expand its circle of allies and create more, I guess, military unions. It is also trying to increase its military cooperation with India. So my question is there a prospect, is there a potential implication of there being less consensus amongst all the allies that US gathers under its wing, if so I can say, because of all the ambivalent priorities of all of those countries? So might there be more of a disconnection in the coming years as more and more countries unite with the United States?
Yeah, you got to understand that a lot of this recent interest in being close to the United States is driven by China. Prior to 2008, China was doing its charm offensive, and people were going, "Oh, this is great. Look at all the economic benefits, and we don't need America, and you guys stay away." And they were pushing us away. And then China got really cocky after the 2008 collapse and decided the Chinese system is better, and therefore we can start to throw our weight around. And the small nations are very aware of the painful Chinese history. You know, for all of the false propaganda China puts out, we never invaded anybody, just isn't true. The Vietnamese fought them for 1,000 years. The longest insurgents in history is Vietnamese fought for over 1,000 years to get rid of China. So it's a lot of this depends on China. If China would go back to a charm offensive and make it believable, then there would be much less interest in associating with the United States and much less interest in spending on defense. You can track the increase in defense expenditures in Asia, particularly, very closely to Chinese behavior. So while America is reaching out and trying to reinforce these allies for our security reasons, they are also very interested, and it's being driven by China. If China backs off, then I think there will be a lot less interest in this. And I'm not clear why China hasn't, other than, again, small group of people, very closed information flow. And so therefore they begin to get the idea that they're on the right track.
Thank you. Well, we had quite a few questions. It was a very intense discussion. Thank you so much for your time, Dr. Hammes. It was great to have you at the seminar. And we look forward to more talks. Thank you so much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you.